What if one of the most pivotal moments in ancient history never happened? Picture this: Rome, 44 years before the Common Era. The Ides of March arrive, but the knives never fall. Julius Caesar walks away unharmed from the Senate, his ambitious vision for Rome still very much alive. That single twist of fate could have rewritten everything we know about the ancient world, and the ripple effects would stretch far beyond the borders of the Roman Republic. Today, we're stepping into a tantalizing alternate timeline where Caesar's survival reshapes empires, transforms cultures, and leaves a mark on history so profound that even our modern world might look unrecognizable. Think about the sheer weight of Caesar's unfinished legacy. At the time of his assassination, he was on the verge of monumental reforms centralizing power, expanding citizenship, even planning military campaigns that would have pushed Rome's borders further than ever before. Had he lived, the Roman Republic might have evolved into something entirely different, avoiding the civil wars that followed and perhaps even preventing the rise of Augustus as the first emperor. Would Rome have become a true imperial superpower centuries earlier? Could Caesar's leadership have stabilized the Republic instead of dooming it to collapse? The possibilities are dizzying, but the real intrigue goes beyond politics and power struggles. Imagine how different our world would be if Caesar's survival altered the course of art, philosophy, and technology. Would Latin have spread even further as a global language? Would Rome's architectural marvels have reached new heights? And what about the expansion of the empire? Might we have seen Roman influence stretching deep into Germania or even further east? This isn't just speculative fiction, it's a doorway into understanding how fragile history truly is. One man's life or death can send shockwaves through centuries. So let's journey together into this fascinating what-if, piecing together the clues from Caesar's own ambitions, the political landscape of his time, and the domino effects that could have changed everything. The story starts now. Caesar's vision for Rome wasn't just ambitious, it was revolutionary. At the height of his power, he was drafting sweeping changes that would have reshaped the Republic from the ground up. One of his boldest plans, land redistribution, a policy aimed at breaking the stranglehold of the elite and giving parcels of territory to veterans and the urban poor. This wasn't just charity, it was a calculated move to cement loyalty among the masses while weakening the senatorial class that opposed him. Had he lived, these reforms could have transformed Rome's social fabric, creating a more stable society with fewer class tensions. Then there's the matter of citizenship. Caesar understood that Rome's strength lay in its people, so he expanded citizenship far beyond Italy, granting it to communities in Gaul and Hispania. Imagine the long-term impact if this policy had continued, a truly unified empire where distant provinces saw themselves as Roman, not conquered subjects. This could have prevented future rebellions, strengthened trade networks, and even altered the cultural identity of Europe. Latin might have become the dominant language centuries earlier, and the concept of a shared Roman identity could have endured long after the empire's fall. But Caesar's ambitions stretched beyond social reforms. Militarily, he was preparing campaigns that would have pushed Rome's borders to unprecedented lengths. Ancient sources suggest he eyed Parthia in the east, seeking revenge for Crassus's defeat, and even dreamed of conquering Germania. With his tactical genius, these campaigns might have succeeded, bringing vast new territories under Roman control. Picture a world where the Rhine, not the Danube, marked the northern frontier where Roman roads, laws, and cities stretched deep into what we now call Germany. The ripple effects would have been staggering, potentially altering the migration patterns that later fractured the empire. And then there's the biggest question of all, the Republic itself. Caesar was already blurring the lines between dictator and monarch, centralizing power in ways that horrified traditionalists. Had he ruled for another decade, Rome might have transitioned smoothly into an imperial system without the bloody civil wars that followed his death. No Augustus, no Antony and Cleopatra, just a single, stable dynasty emerging from Caesar's reforms. The Republic's collapse wasn't inevitable. It was the result of chaos after his assassination. In this alternate timeline, Rome could have avoided decades of infighting, emerging stronger and more unified than ever. Yet for all his brilliance, Caesar's survival wouldn't have guaranteed utopia. Centralizing power came with risks. Corruption, stagnation, or even tyranny could have taken root. And while his reforms might have strengthened Rome in the short term, they could also have sparked new conflicts as old elites pushed back. History is never as simple as what if. But one thing's certain, Caesar's unfinished plans held the seeds of a completely different Roman destiny, one where the empire's rise was swifter, its reach wider, and its legacy even more enduring. The world we know might have been shaped by a Rome that never was. The Roman Republic's fate hinged on a delicate balance, one that Caesar's survival would have shattered far sooner than history remembers. While Augustus is often credited with Rome's transition from republic to empire, that shift was slow, calculated, and wrapped in the illusion of tradition. Caesar, by contrast, had no patience for political theater. His approach was blunt, power centralized, authority unquestioned, and the Senate reduced to a ceremonial body. Had he lived, the Republic's collapse wouldn't have been a quiet fading. It would have been a seismic rupture, upending centuries of precedent in a single generation. Consider how differently power would have been wielded. Augustus cloaked his autocracy in republican titles, preserving the Senate's facade while draining its real influence. Caesar, though, openly flaunted his dominance, accepting lifelong dictatorships and filling the Senate with loyalists. Under his prolonged rule, the old aristocratic families might have lost their grip entirely, replaced by a new class of administrators loyal only to him. Laws would no longer emerge from debate but from decree, turning Rome's legal system into an extension of one man's will, the checks and balances that once defined the Republic. Gone, erased by the sheer force of Caesar's ambition. And what of the people? Augustus won hearts by portraying himself as a restorer of peace, but Caesar's Rome would have been a place of relentless transformation. His populist policies, land for veterans, grain for the poor, might have bought temporary loyalty, but without the Senate to temper his whims, stability could have crumbled. The very reforms that strengthened his support could also have bred dependency, creating a state where power flowed solely from the dictator's favor. Imagine a Rome where political careers didn't hinge on senatorial approval, but on currying Caesar's personal attention. The Republic's meritocratic ideals would have withered, replaced by a court-like system of patronage. Then there's the military. Augustus reformed the legions into a professional standing army, loyal to the state rather than individual generals. Caesar's forces, however, were bound to him by personal allegiance. Had he ruled for decades, the army might never have been depoliticized, leaving Rome vulnerable to the very warlordism that doomed the Republic. Future conflicts could have seen generals battling not for the Senate's approval but for Caesar's inheritance, turning succession into a bloody free-for-all. Yet the most striking difference lies in timing. Augustus's rise came after years of civil war, when exhaustion made Romans crave order at any cost. Caesar's uninterrupted rule would have forced that order upon them while the Republic's institutions were still intact, meaning resistance could have been fiercer, rebellions more frequent. The patrician class wouldn't have surrendered quietly. We might have seen purges, confiscations, even open revolts as the old guard fought to preserve their privileges. In the end, the Republic's death under Caesar wouldn't have been a transition. It would have been a revolution, and the empire that emerged might have been stronger for it, or it might have collapsed under the weight of its own abrupt birth. One thing certain, the Rome we know was shaped by Augustus's patience, but the Rome that could have been, that was Caesar's alone to build or to break. Caesar's military ambitions didn't stop at Gaul, they were just the beginning. Picture a world where his legions marched east, not just to avenge Crassus's humiliating defeat at Carrhae, but to carve a permanent Roman presence into the heart of Parthia. This wasn't mere revenge, it was a strategic masterstroke. Parthia controlled the Silk Road's western hubs, and conquering it would have given Rome direct access to the wealth of Asia. Trade routes that once funneled gold and spices through foreign hands could have become Roman highways, flooding the empire with silk, precious metals, and exotic goods. The economic boom would have been staggering, funding further expansion and transforming Rome into the undisputed center of global commerce. But Caesar's gaze wasn't fixed solely on the east. Germania, with its vast forests and untapped resources, represented another frontier ripe for conquest. Previous campaigns had stalled at the Rhine, but Caesar's tactical brilliance and relentless ambition might have pushed Rome's borders deep into what we now call Germany. Imagine Roman cities rising along the Elbe, their roads connecting the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The cultural impact would have been profound. Latin might have replaced Germanic languages in the region, and the tribes that later fractured the empire could have been assimilated centuries earlier. No Teutoburg forest disaster, no prolonged border wars, just a fully Romanized north, secure and prosperous. Then there's the tantalizing question of how far east Caesar's ambitions truly stretched. Ancient historians whispered of plans to rival Alexander, to march beyond Parthia into the unknown realms of India. While this might sound like fantasy, Caesar's track record suggests he wouldn't have shied away from the attempt. Even a partial success, say, securing Mesopotamia or the Caucasus, would have reshaped Eurasia's geopolitical map. The fusion of Roman and Persian influences could have birthed a hybrid culture, blending architectural styles, philosophies, and technologies in ways history never saw. Yet conquest alone doesn't sustain an empire. Caesar understood this better than anyone. His campaigns would have been followed by waves of colonization veterans settling in newly conquered lands, bringing Roman law, engineering, and governance with them. These weren't just military outposts, they were seeds of permanent transformation. A Roman Germania might have developed sprawling agricultural estates, feeding the empire's heartland. A Roman Parthia could have become the gateway for innovations like stirrups or advanced irrigation, flowing westward centuries ahead of schedule. The ripple effects extend beyond borders and trade. Think of the intellectual exchange. Greek scholars in the East, Persian astronomers, Indian mathematicians all could have found patronage in a Rome that stretched into their homelands. The Library of Alexandria might have had rivals in Antioch or Babylon, each a beacon of learning under Roman protection. Philosophy, science, even religion could have evolved along dramatically different lines, with ideas circulating freely across a unified empire. But let's not romanticize this. Every conquest comes at a cost. Caesar's relentless campaigns would have drained Rome's manpower and treasury, potentially sparking unrest at home. Overextension could have left the empire vulnerable, its borders too vast to defend. And what of the cultures erased or subsumed in Rome's march? History is rarely kind to the conquered. Yet one thing's certain, Caesar's survival would have accelerated Rome's transformation from a Mediterranean power into a truly global force, its influence radiating across continents centuries before the modern era. The world map might look unrecognizable, and so would we. Caesar's economic vision was as bold as his military campaigns, a radical overhaul designed to tackle Rome's most deep-seated financial crises. At the time of his death, the Republic was drowning in debt, with soaring interest rates crushing ordinary citizens and elite moneylenders exploiting the chaos. Caesar's solution, a sweeping debt restructuring program that slashed outstanding balances by a quarter and abolished the barbaric practice of debt slavery. This wasn't just relief, it was a reset button for Rome's economy. Had these policies taken root, they could have stabilized the financial system for generations, preventing the inflationary spirals and currency collapses that later weakened the empire. But debt relief was only the beginning. Caesar understood that Rome's wealth depended on circulation, money moving through hands, not hoarded in patrician villas. He flooded the streets with new construction projects, employing thousands to rebuild aqueducts, theaters, and roads. These weren't vanity projects, they were economic engines. Wages flowed to workers who spent them at markets, stimulating trade and small businesses. Imagine this momentum sustained over decades, a virtuous cycle where public investment fueled private prosperity. The economic turbulence that followed his death, including the crippling grain shortages and currency devaluations of Augustus's early reign, those might never have happened under Caesar's steady hand. Then there's the matter of Rome's provinces. Before Caesar, provincial governors treated their postings as personal piggy banks, extracting wealth through punitive taxes and corruption. Caesar cracked down hard, imposing strict term limits and accountability measures. Had he lived, this system could have matured into a transparent bureaucracy, transforming provinces from exploited territories into thriving contributors to the imperial economy. Tax revenues would have flowed reliably to Rome instead of lining governors' pockets, funding further infrastructure and military expansion without burdening the plebeians. The real game-changer, though, was Caesar's monetary policy. He introduced Rome's first gold standard, minting the aureus to stabilize trade across the Mediterranean. With decades of consistent currency behind it, Rome's economy might have avoided the boom and bust cycles that later led to hyperinflation. Merchants from Alexandria to Britannia could have traded with confidence, knowing their coins held real value. This financial stability would have attracted foreign investment, making Rome the economic hub of the ancient world centuries earlier. Yet the most profound impact might have been political. Economic desperation fueled the civil wars after Caesar's death. Veterans dispossessed, farmers bankrupt, soldiers willing to follow any general who promised plunder. A stable, prosperous Rome under Caesar's long rule could have starved these conflicts of their oxygen. No desperate masses rallying to Augustus or Antony, no provinces ravaged by competing armies. Instead, a unified empire where loyalty was bought not with swords, but with bread, jobs, and fair governance. Of course, no system is foolproof. Caesar's reforms carried risks over centralization, could have stifled local innovation, or his gold reserves might have been drained by endless wars. But the alternative we got was far worse. A century of economic instability that only ended when Augustus rebuilt what Caesar had begun. The tragedy isn't just that Rome lost a visionary leader, it's that it lost the chance to avoid its darkest economic chapters altogether. Caesar's Rome wasn't just built on conquest, it thrived on transformation. His policies tore down barriers between Romans and the peoples they ruled, weaving a new social fabric where loyalty mattered more than lineage. Take his radical approach to citizenship. By granting it to entire communities in Gaul and Hispania, he didn't just expand the empire, he redefined what it meant to be Roman. Picture a world where this vision flourished for decades. Provinces once seen as foreign could have become heartlands, their elites rising to senatorial rank, their traditions blending with Rome's. The cultural divide between conqueror and conquered might have faded faster than we can imagine, creating a truly Mediterranean identity centuries ahead of schedule. Language would have been the glue binding this new society. Latin wasn't just a tool of administration under Caesar, it was a ladder. His support for educating provincial elites in Roman ways ensured that speaking Latin became synonymous with opportunity. Had this policy continued, we might have seen Gaulish or Iberian tongues fade as Latin took root, not through force but through sheer practicality. Think of how English spread globally, not just by empire but because it opened doors. Caesar's Rome could have achieved that linguistic dominance 2,000 years earlier, leaving fewer linguistic fractures when the empire eventually declined. Then there's the plebeians' Rome's often overlooked backbone. Caesar's land reforms and grain subsidies weren't charity, they were investments in social stability. By lifting the urban poor out of desperation, he created a loyal class with stakes in the system. Over time, this could have birthed a robust middle-class artisans, shopkeepers, and small landowners fueling economic growth. The stark divide between the senatorial elite and the masses might have softened, preventing the class resentment that later fueled riots and rebellions. Art and architecture tell another story. Caesar's building projects didn't just employ plebeians, they showcased Rome's new diversity. Theaters rising in Narbo, temples in Carthage, these weren't colonial impositions but shared spaces where local styles blended with Roman grandeur. Imagine how this cultural fusion might have evolved. Gallic motifs adorning Roman villas, African spiritual practices merging with state religion. The rigid Romanitas of Augustus's era could have given way to a vibrant, adaptive identity, richer for its inclusivity. Yet integration has its tensions. Traditionalists would have resisted this leveling of hierarchies, clinging to the old distinctions between patrician and plebeian, Roman and provincial. Caesar's challenge wasn't just implementing reforms, it was making them stick against entrenched opposition. His survival might have meant purges of the old guard, or perhaps a gradual erosion of their influence as new men rose through the ranks. Either way, the social order would have looked profoundly different, less a pyramid, more a mosaic. The most lasting impact, though, might have been on Rome's collective psyche. An empire that saw itself as inclusive from its foundation would have approached expansion differently, not as plunder but as partnership. Rebellions like Boudicca's or the Jewish revolts often sprang from cultural alienation. In Caesar's alternate timeline, these flashpoints might never have ignited. The provinces could have felt genuinely Roman, their loyalty unshaken by exploitation. This isn't to say his vision was perfect. Rapid integration can breed resentment, and not all cultures surrender their identity willingly. But the Rome that emerged would have been fundamentally different, not just in borders or laws, but in soul. A place where being Roman wasn't about where you were born, but what you could become. That legacy, more than any conquest, might have been Caesar's greatest gift to history. Caesar's survival could have reshaped the religious destiny of the Western world. At the time of his assassination, Rome's religious landscape was a tapestry of traditional gods, imported cults, and local deities, all tolerated as long as they didn't challenge state authority. But Caesar's approach to religion wasn't just passive acceptance, it was strategic assimilation. He positioned himself as both high priest and divine descendant, weaving his cult of personality into the fabric of Roman worship. Had he ruled for decades, this fusion of politics and piety might have created a state religion so powerful that emerging faiths like Christianity would have struggled to gain traction. Consider the timing. Christianity's rise relied on the chaos of the first-century weak emperors, bureaucratic inefficiency, and a fractured empire that allowed underground movements to flourish. Under Caesar's ironclad rule, that chaos wouldn't have existed. His government would have been too efficient, his surveillance too pervasive for a radical sect to spread unnoticed. Missionaries like Paul might have faced immediate suppression rather than finding pockets of tolerance in distant provinces, and without the Jewish revolts that later destabilized Judea, Christianity's roots in Jewish descent could have been severed before they deepened. Then there's the matter of syncretism, Caesar's knack for blending foreign traditions with Roman statecraft. Imagine if he'd encountered early Christian teachings not as a threat, but as raw material for his imperial cult. Figures like Jesus might have been absorbed into the pantheon as minor saints or local manifestations of Sol Invictus, Caesar's favored sun god. The cross could have become just another symbol in Rome's eclectic spiritual arsenal, stripped of its revolutionary meaning. This wasn't just possible, it was Caesar's modus operandi. In Gaul, he'd already co-opted local druids into his administrative system. Why not do the same with Christian bishops? But the real game changer might have been persecution, or the lack of it. Christianity thrived under Roman oppression, its martyrs becoming powerful symbols of resistance. A Caesar who saw value in the faith might have denied it that galvanizing hardship. Instead of fed to lions, Christians could have been bureaucratized, given minor civic roles that diluted their fervor. No martyrs, no compelling narrative of sacrifice, just another fringe group slowly fading into Rome's spiritual marketplace. Yet history is rarely so predictable. Even under strong central rule, religious movements can erupt in unexpected ways. Caesar's own assassination proved how quickly order can shatter, and Christianity's appeal, its message of hope for the oppressed, might have found fertile ground among the very plebeians Caesar's reforms lifted up. A stable, prosperous Rome could have ironically given Christians safer roads to spread their teachings farther and faster. The ripple effects are dizzying. No state-sponsored Christianity might have meant no medieval church, no crusades, no reformation. Philosophy and science could have evolved along entirely different lines, free from ecclesiastical constraints. Or perhaps another monotheistic faith would have filled the vacuum, Mithraism, with its soldier-friendly rituals, or a reformed Judaism expanding beyond its ethnic roots. One thing's certain, Caesar's Rome wouldn't have been Constantine's Rome. The religious revolution that shaped 2 millennia might have been stillborn or transformed beyond recognition. And the spiritual landscape of the modern world would be as foreign to us as Caesar's unbroken reign is to history. Caesar didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to rebuild it in his own image. At the time of his death, the city was a chaotic maze of narrow alleys and crumbling tenements, its public spaces dwarfed by the grandeur of Hellenistic cities like Alexandria. But blueprints were already drawn up for a transformation so radical it would have left later emperors struggling to keep up. The Forum Julium, his first major project, was just the opening act. Envisioned as a gleaming marble showcase flanked by colonnades and centered around a temple to Venus Genetrix, it wasn't merely a plaza, it was a statement. This would have been the nucleus of a redesigned Rome, where broad boulevards replaced fire-prone slums and aqueducts delivered fresh water to neighborhoods once reliant on polluted wells. Now picture what decades of uninterrupted construction could have achieved. Caesar's engineers had plans to reroute the Tiber itself, taming its floods with massive embankments while freeing up prime real estate along its banks. The Campus Martius, then a floodplain used for military drills, might have become a meticulously planned district of libraries, theaters, and sprawling baths, a cultural hub to rival the Acropolis. Unlike Augustus's piecemeal additions, Caesar's vision was holistic. His Rome wouldn't just grow, it would be reborn with infrastructure to match its imperial ambitions. Sewers wide enough for wagons, fireproof concrete apartments for the plebeians, even a proposed canal linking the Tiber to Naples harbor. These weren't vanity projects. They were the bones of a city built to last 1,000 years. The architectural language of this alternate Rome would have been unmistakable. Caesar favored scale and speed, employing prefabricated techniques to erect buildings in months, not years. His surviving theater of Marcellus, though completed by Augustus, hints at what could have been, a fusion of Greek elegance and Roman audacity, where travertine met gilt bronze under sweeping arches. Had he lived, we might have seen a pantheon like Marvel decades earlier, its dome a testament to concrete's potential. And unlike later emperors who stamped their names on recycled designs, Caesar's structures would have pushed engineering boundaries. Think multi-story harbors, glass-ceilinged markets, or even the first true skyscrapers using revolutionary brick-faced concrete. Beyond aesthetics, these projects served a political masterstroke. Unemployment fueled unrest in Rome, and Caesar's construction boom would have kept tens of thousands gainfully employed, masons, carpenters, and artists all indebted to his patronage. The plebeians wouldn't just admire their transformed city, they'd owe their livelihoods to it. Meanwhile, the elite's grip on urban land would have been broken as Caesar confiscated private estates to build his grand avenues. The social impact can't be overstated. A Rome where public space belonged unequivocally to the people, its skyline a daily reminder of who delivered this modernity. Yet the most tantalizing what-ifs lie beyond Rome's borders. Caesar understood that architecture was empire's most visible export. His colonies, from Carthage to Corinth, would have been showpieces of urban planning, standardized down to their grid layouts and forum dimensions. Imagine a world where Romanization didn't creep gradually through local imitation, but arrived fully formed, with identical basilicas rising simultaneously in Gaul, Africa, and Hispania. The psychological effect is profound, a unified architectural language making provincial cities feel not conquered, but elevated. Of course, grand visions demand grand resources. Caesar's building spree might have drained the treasury or cut corners in quality. His haste to complete projects sometimes compromised their longevity. And not everyone would have welcomed the upheaval. The Rome of his youth, with its tangled streets and clan-owned neighborhoods, held centuries of memory. Erasing it entirely risked severing ties to the past, leaving a city magnificent but soulless. What emerges from the blueprints and fragments is a Rome unshackled from tradition, a capital where form followed function and function served ideology. No Augustus painstakingly restoring republican facades, no Nero selfishly sculpting a golden palace, just a relentless, practical vision of urbanism as empire building. The irony, the Rome we know became magnificent because later emperors competed to outbuild each other. But the Rome that could have been, it would have been magnificent from day one, with a single mind directing its metamorphosis. The skyline wouldn't whisper of emperors, it would shout one name louder than all others: Caesar. Caesar's alliance with Cleopatra wasn't just a scandalous romance, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. By aligning with Egypt's last pharaoh, he gained access to the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, a breadbasket whose grain fed Rome's masses and whose treasury could bankroll his ambitions. Had their partnership endured, the ripple effects would have reshaped two civilizations. Egypt might never have faced the tragic end we know, no dramatic suicides, no reduction to a mere province. Instead, it could have evolved into a semi-autonomous power within Rome's orbit, a hybrid culture where pharaonic traditions blended seamlessly with Roman innovation. Think about the practical implications. Alexandria's legendary library, already the intellectual capital of the ancient world, might have flourished under Caesar's patronage rather than suffering the gradual decline that followed Cleopatra's death. Scholars from across the empire could have flocked to its halls, accelerating discoveries in astronomy, medicine, and engineering. The famous Mausoleum, home to thinkers like Euclid and Archimedes, might have become a state-sponsored research hub under Roman protection, an ancient version of Silicon Valley funded by imperial coffers. The fusion of Greek-Egyptian knowledge with Roman practicality could have sparked a scientific renaissance centuries ahead of schedule. Politically, Cleopatra's influence would have been transformative. Unlike Rome's other client kingdoms, Egypt wasn't some distant outpost. It was a peer civilization with sophisticated administration and deep cultural prestige. Had Caesar lived, he might have formalized their alliance through marriage, creating a dual monarchy that ruled from both Rome and Alexandria. Their son Caesarion, rather than being hunted down by Augustus, could have been groomed as a successor, forging a dynasty that literally bridged two worlds. The Mediterranean wouldn't have been divided between East and West. It might have been united under a single Greco-Roman-Egyptian identity from the start. Trade routes tell another story. Egypt controlled access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean beyond, a monopoly Caesar could have leveraged to bypass Parthia entirely. Imagine Roman merchant fleets sailing directly to India, their holds filled with Egyptian glass and papyrus, returning with spices and silks. The economic windfall would have dwarfed anything Rome extracted through taxation, potentially making the empire less reliant on squeezing its provinces dry. The Nile's bounty, combined with Rome's logistical prowess, might have created an economic powerhouse unmatched until the Industrial Revolution, yet the cultural exchange runs even deeper. Egyptian religion fascinated Romans with its animal-headed gods and obsession with the afterlife. Under Caesar's rule, the cult of Isis might have been adopted as a state religion alongside Jupiter and Mars, blending theology in ways history never saw. Architectural styles could have merged two picture pyramids clad in marble, or obelisks rising in the Roman Forum alongside traditional temples. Even daily life might have transformed, Romans wearing linen in summer, Egyptian scribes teaching hieroglyphs as a scholarly pursuit, the calendar reformed to sync with the Nile's floods. But let's not romanticize this. Cleopatra was a canny ruler who understood the precariousness of her position. With Caesar alive, she might have pushed for even greater autonomy, playing Rome off against other powers. Egypt's wealth could have made it a rival rather than a partner, leading to tensions over control of the grain supply or Red Sea ports, and Rome's traditionalists would have bristled at sharing power with a foreign queen, potentially sparking new conflicts. The most poignant what-if lies in legacy. In our timeline, Augustus turned Egypt into a personal fiefdom, its history reduced to a cautionary tale about fallen monarchs. Under Caesar's vision, it might have remained a vibrant, independent-minded partner, a civilization that shaped Rome as much as Rome shaped it. The Mediterranean wouldn't have been a Roman lake, but something far more interesting, a true melting pot where pharaohs and emperors built something neither could have achieved alone. The lost potential is staggering not just for these two rulers, but for the course of art, science, and power across millennia. The knives that never struck Caesar would have turned against those who wielded them with terrifying speed. Brutus, Cassius, and their fellow conspirators gambled on reviving the Republic, but in a world where Caesar survived the Ides of March, their fate wouldn't have been political exile, it would have been annihilation. Caesar wasn't known for half measures when betrayed. Just recall how he dealt with Pompey's supporters after Pharsalus. Pardons offered once, never twice. The assassins wouldn't have gotten even that courtesy. Their deaths would have been public, theatrical, and designed to send an unmistakable message to any other would-be conspirators lurking in the Senate's shadows. Consider how differently the purge would have unfolded compared to history's timeline. In our reality, the assassins fled Rome, raised armies, and plunged the Republic into another civil war, the so-called Liberators' conflict that drained Rome's resources and set the stage for Augustus's rise. But with Caesar alive, their rebellion would have been stillborn. No sympathetic provinces would have risked sheltering them. No legions would have defected to their cause. Caesar's network of client kings and loyal governors would have hunted them like fugitives, their names stripped from public records, their properties confiscated before they could rally support. The cleanup would have been surgical, leaving no martyrs to inspire future opposition. The ripple effects on Rome's elite would have been seismic. Caesar's revenge wouldn't have stopped at the assassins themselves. It would have gutted the old aristocratic families who backed them. The Junii, the Cassii, and their allies might have seen entire lineages erased through proscriptions, their centuries-old influence vaporized overnight. In their place, a new ruling class handpicked from Caesar's allies. Gaulish chieftains granted senatorial seats, wealthy plebeians elevated to patrician status, even freedmen entrusted with administrative power. The Senate's composition would have shifted irreversibly, becoming less a council of elders and more a rubber stamp for Caesar's will. Yet the most profound consequence might have been psychological. The failed assassination would have shattered the illusion that the Republic's traditions could restrain autocracy. Future generations of senators, raised under Caesar's shadow, would have learned compliance rather than defiance. No Brutus-style idealism, no Cato-esque principled stands, just pragmatic adaptation to absolute rule. The very concept of tyrannicide could have been discredited for centuries, altering how later emperors faced dissent. Imagine a Rome where no one dared whisper against Caligula or Nero because Caesar's precedent taught them the cost. But let's not assume this purge would have been bloodless for Caesar either. Eliminating the old guard might have created a power vacuum, with rival factions scrambling to prove their loyalty by denouncing imagined plots. The same paranoia that fueled Stalin's purges or the French Revolution's terror could have taken root in Rome, turning the Senate into a snake pit of accusations. Caesar's Rome might have been stable in the short term, but at what cost to its institutional resilience? One thing's certain: the conspirators' failure would have rewritten Rome's political playbook. No civil war meant no need for Augustus's delicate balancing act between vengeance and reconciliation. No Philippi, no Perusine war, just a single, unbroken arc of centralized power stretching from Caesar's survival to his natural death. The Republic's last defenders wouldn't have fallen in battle. They'd have been erased from history itself, their legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the futility of resisting destiny. And Rome, it would have woken to a new reality, that the price of defiance wasn't just death but oblivion. Augustus's rise was never inevitable. It was born from the ashes of Caesar's assassination. Without that bloody turning point, the ambitious young Octavian might have remained just another privileged nephew, overshadowed by his legendary great-uncle. A political void that propelled him to power wouldn't have existed. No power struggle with Antony, no propaganda war painting him as Caesar's rightful heir. Just a talented but untested aristocrat waiting in the wings while a living Caesar shaped Rome's future. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which defined Rome's first century, might never have formed at all. Consider the stark differences in governance. Augustus mastered the art of illusion, cloaking autocracy in republican traditions to soothe a traumatized Rome. But Caesar, he had no patience for such theatrics. His rule would have been transparently authoritarian, leaving no room for the delicate balance of powers Augustus crafted. The Principate, a careful dance between emperor and senate, might never have emerged. Instead, Rome could have transitioned directly into a Hellenistic-style monarchy with no pretense of shared authority. The consequences ripple outward. No need for the subtle propaganda of Augustus's golden age, no carefully staged restoration of the Republic, just raw, unchallenged power flowing from one man to his chosen successor. Cultural achievements tell another story. Augustus's reign gave us Virgil's Aeneid, Horace's Odes, and the marble-clad splendor of imperial Rome, all part of a calculated campaign to legitimize his rule. Caesar's priorities lay elsewhere. His patronage favored practical genius over poetic flattery, engineers over epic poets, urban planners over court historians. The Augustan cultural renaissance, with its nostalgic glorification of Rome's mythical past, might have been replaced by something far more modern, a celebration of technical innovation and multicultural fusion. Picture a world where Rome's greatest literary masterpiece isn't an epic poem linking Augustus to Aeneas, but perhaps a groundbreaking work of geography or mechanics funded by Caesar's pragmatism. Then there's the matter of succession. Augustus spent decades carefully grooming Tiberius despite their mutual disdain because the alternatives were worse. Caesar showed no such hesitation. He bypassed tradition entirely, naming Octavian heir in his will despite their distant blood relation. Had he ruled another 20 years, he might have sidelined Octavian altogether in favor of a more capable protege, or even Cleopatra's son Caesarion. The Julio-Claudians' intergenerational drama, Caligula's madness, Nero's excesses could have been swapped for an entirely different set of crises under a Greco-Egyptian, blooded dynasty. The empire's very structure might have diverged. Augustus spent years consolidating power, cautiously testing how much authority Romans would tolerate. Caesar would have charged ahead, implementing radical reforms without consensus. Provincial administration, tax collection, even the military structure, all might have been streamlined decades earlier, avoiding the bureaucratic bloat that later weakened the empire. But haste carries risks. Where Augustus's slow, methodical approach created stability, Caesar's relentless pace could have sparked resistance, leaving his successors to grapple with rebellions his impatience ignited. Most haunting is the question of legacy. Augustus's reign became the golden standard against which all later emperors were measured. Without that template, Rome's imperial model might have been far more autocratic from the start, or far more decentralized. The delicate fiction of the emperor as first among equals might never have taken root, making the transition between rulers even more volatile. And the Pax Romana, that two-century span of relative peace, could have arrived earlier under Caesar's firm hand, or never materialized at all amidst constant expansion and reform. The Julio-Claudians left an indelible mark on history, but their entire existence hinged on a single act of violence in 44 BCE. Remove that moment, and Rome's imperial story rewrites itself from the ground up, not just who held power, but how power itself was understood. The alternative isn't merely a different set of rulers, but a different definition of what it meant to rule. Caesar's approach to law wasn't about preserving tradition. It was about rewriting the rules entirely. At the time of his death, Rome's legal system was a tangled web of ancient precedents, open to manipulation by wealthy elites who could afford the best advocates. Caesar saw this dysfunction firsthand and launched reforms that cut through the chaos. His Julian laws standardized penalties, cracked down on electoral bribery, and even set term limits for provincial governors to curb exploitation. Had these changes taken root over decades, they could have transformed Roman justice from a privilege of the elite into a true system for all. Consider the long-term implications of codification. Caesar's legal team was already compiling Rome's statutes into accessible volumes, a radical departure from the scattered decrees and senatorial opinions that lawyers once had to hunt down. With sustained momentum, this effort might have produced something unprecedented, a unified legal code clear enough for ordinary citizens to understand. No more obscure rituals or technical loopholes, just straightforward rules applied equally across the empire. This shift could have preempted the Byzantine Justinian Code by 6 centuries, giving Europe a head start on the concept of rule of law. Corruption was another prime target. Caesar's laws punished jewelry, tampering, and extortion harshly, with penalties that struck at the heart of aristocratic impunity. Imagine this anti-graft campaign sustained over 20 years. The senatorial class's ability to buy verdicts or loot provinces would have been broken, replaced by professional judges drawn from the equestrian order or even promising freedmen. The ripple effects are staggering: less oppressive taxation in the provinces, fewer rebellions sparked by injustice, and a bureaucracy where merit outweighed family connections. Then there's the matter of citizenship rights. Caesar extended legal protections to communities beyond Italy, granting them access to Roman courts. Over time, this could have evolved into a truly imperial legal framework where a merchant in Gaul had the same recourse as one in Rome itself. Trade would have flourished under predictable dispute resolution, and localized legal traditions might have blended into a hybrid system: Celtic contract customs refined by Roman formalism, or Egyptian property laws adapted for imperial use. The resulting legal synthesis could have become the foundation for medieval European law, skipping centuries of fragmented feudal codes, yet the most revolutionary change might have been procedural. Caesar streamlined trials by imposing strict timelines, ending the endless delays wealthy defendants used to outlast their accusers. Surviving speeches from his era reveal how often justice was obstructed by procedural games: witnesses intimidated, hearings postponed, evidence lost. A long-reigning Caesar could have institutionalized swift, evidence-based trials, setting a precedent that influenced everything from medieval canon law to modern courtroom practice. Of course, no system is perfect. Centralized legal authority risked becoming a tool of tyranny in weaker hands, and without the Republic's checks and balances, bad emperors might have twisted Caesar's efficient courts into instruments of oppression. But the alternative, the slow, uneven legal development Rome actually experienced, left gaping inequities that fueled unrest for generations. Caesar's blueprint offered something radical: the idea that law could be both fair and fast, both universal and adaptable. That vision, fully realized, might have changed not just Rome's destiny, but the very DNA of Western justice. Caesar's hunger for progress wasn't limited to conquest. It extended to the very tools that made conquest possible. His military campaigns had already pushed engineering to new heights, with prefabricated bridges built in days and siege engines redesigned for unprecedented mobility. But with decades of uninterrupted rule, these wartime innovations could have blossomed into civilian revolutions. Picture Roman roads evolving beyond simple stone slabs to incorporate advanced drainage systems that prevented flooding, or aqueducts using pressurized pipes to reach higher elevations, technologies that didn't appear until the Renaissance. Caesar's engineers were already experimenting with hydraulic concrete that hardened underwater. Given time, they might have perfected arched dams or even primitive water turbines to harness river power for mills and workshops. Medicine would have been another frontier transformed. Caesar's personal physician, Antistius, pioneered new surgical techniques to treat battlefield wounds, from arterial clamps to improved bone-setting methods. Under sustained imperial patronage, These advances could have expanded into public health initiatives, state-funded hospitals in every major city, systematic training for physicians, even early attempts at germ theory inspired by the cleanliness of military infirmaries. The legion's reliance on herbal remedies might have led to formal botanical gardens cultivating medicinal plants empire-wide, turning folk knowledge into standardized pharmacology. Diseases that ravaged ancient cities, from dysentery to malaria, could have met organized resistance centuries before the first medieval hospitals arose. Then there's the tantalizing realm of theoretical science. Caesar's close ties to Alexandria, home to the legendary library, gave him direct access to the Mediterranean's brightest minds. Unlike later emperors who viewed abstract research as a luxury, he recognized its practical value. Greek mathematicians like Sosigenes, who reformed Rome's calendar at Caesar's request, might have received funding for more ambitious projects, refining astronomical instruments to improve navigation, or calculating the Earth's circumference with unprecedented accuracy. The mechanical inventions of Hero of Alexandria, steam-powered devices, and automated temple wonders could have moved from curiosities to practical applications under imperial sponsorship. Imagine Roman factories using gear systems to mass-produce goods, or cargo ships guided by early versions of the astrolabe. The most profound leap might have come in materials science. Caesar's builders were already improving concrete formulas, but with systematic research, they could have developed reinforced variants using iron rods, an innovation that skipped 18 centuries of trial and error. Glassmaking, too, stood on the verge of transformation. Transparent window panes were still rare luxuries, but centralized imperial workshops might have standardized production, making them commonplace in public buildings and even middle-class homes. The resulting improvements in lighting and insulation could have reshaped architecture, allowing taller structures with larger interior spaces. Yet the true measure of progress lies not in individual inventions, but in systems. Caesar grasped the power of infrastructure, from roads to courier networks. His survival could have birthed state-sponsored research academies where engineers, physicians, and philosophers collaborated under one roof, an ancient counterpart to modern think tanks. The bureaucratic machinery that efficiently taxed provinces might have been repurposed to collect scientific data, weather patterns, crop yields, even disease outbreaks analyzed to guide policy. This marriage of administration and inquiry could have sparked an enlightenment not seen until the Islamic Golden Age. Of course, progress isn't inevitable. Without the competitive pressures of later empires, Roman innovation might have plateaued once immediate needs were met. And centralized control carries risks. What if a less visionary successor slashed research budgets or suppressed ideas that challenged tradition? But the trajectory is clear. Caesar's Rome wouldn't have just preserved Greek knowledge. It would have industrialized it, scaled it, and thrust the ancient world centuries closer to modernity. The gears of history turned slower after his death, but in this alternate timeline, they might have spun fast enough to change everything. Caesar's gaze eastward wasn't just about conquest, it was a gateway to unimaginable wealth. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes linking China to the Mediterranean, was still in its infancy during his lifetime. But with Rome's legions securing Parthia and pushing toward Central Asia, those tentative caravan trails could have transformed into imperial highways decades earlier. Picture Roman merchants bypassing middlemen to trade directly with Han Dynasty officials, their caravans laden not just with silk, but with innovations, paper-making techniques from China, steel smelting secrets from India, even early forms of gunpowder compounds used for fireworks. The exchange would have flowed both ways: Roman glassware dazzling Eastern courts, Mediterranean wines becoming a status symbol in Chang'an, and perhaps most crucially, agricultural knowledge spreading faster. Imagine Chinese watermill technology reaching Roman farms a century earlier, boosting crop yields to sustain growing cities. The economic impact would have been seismic. In our timeline, silk was so rare in Rome that it was worth its weight in gold, creating a massive trade deficit that drained imperial coffers. But with direct access to the source, Caesar could have negotiated bulk purchases, stabilizing prices and ensuring a steady flow of luxury goods to fuel Rome's economy. More importantly, he might have recognized the strategic value of controlling choke points along the route, oases like Palmyra or Merv becoming fortified trading hubs under Roman oversight. These wouldn't just be way stations, they'd be cultural melting pots where Persian astronomers exchanged star charts with Roman engineers, and Buddhist monks debated philosophy with Stoic scholars. The intellectual cross-pollination alone could have accelerated scientific progress across continents. Then there's the naval dimension. Caesar's planned campaign against Parthia might have revealed what later Romans discovered too late. The sea route to India was far more efficient than overland caravans. With his characteristic pragmatism, he could have commissioned fleets to sail from Egyptian ports, riding monsoon winds to Indian harbors. Roman shipbuilding, already advanced, might have leapfrogged ahead with Indian teakwood and Chinese compass designs, creating vessels capable of reaching Southeast Asia's spice islands. The pepper trade, which later enriched medieval Venice, could have been a state-controlled enterprise filling Rome's treasury centuries earlier. But the real game-changer lies in what didn't happen. Without the bottleneck of later middlemen, technologies might have spread unpredictably. Han Dynasty iron plows revolutionizing European agriculture, Roman concrete techniques strengthening the Great Wall, or Greek medical texts circulating in Indian universities. Even diseases would have traveled differently. The Antonine Plague that devastated Rome in the 2nd century might have arrived earlier but with less catastrophic impact as immunity built up gradually. The balance of power between East and West could have shifted profoundly, with Rome and China recognizing each other as peer civilizations rather than distant myths. Diplomatic envoys might have crossed the Tarim Basin regularly, negotiating tariffs instead of arrows. Yet for all its potential, this Silk Road Golden Age would have faced stark challenges. Parthian resistance didn't vanish with a few battles, and steppe nomads like the Xiongnu would still have raided caravans. Roman greed could have overextended supply lines or worse, triggered conflicts with the Han over control of key routes. And let's not romanticize the exchange. Alongside silk and spices, slavery and opium would have flowed westward with devastating social costs, the most tantalizing what-if. A world where Marco Polo's journey wasn't remarkable because the East and West already knew each other intimately, where the phrase Silk Road didn't evoke mystery but mundane commerce like shipping lanes or railway networks. Caesar's Rome might not just have rewritten its own history, but the entire rhythm of globalization, compressing timelines and erasing boundaries in ways we're only now catching up to today. Rome's collapse wasn't written in the stars, it was the result of cracks that began widening long before the final fall. Under Caesar's unbroken leadership, those fractures might never have formed. His vision wasn't just about conquest, it was about creating systems that could endure. Take the military, for example. The late empire's reliance on mercenaries and fragmented legions left it vulnerable to barbarian invasions. But Caesar's legions were loyal to him personally. Yes, but more importantly, they were deeply Romanized, drawn from citizens and allies who saw themselves as stakeholders in the empire's future. Had this model continued, Rome might have maintained a professional, cohesive fighting force rather than depending on outsiders who had no real allegiance to the state. Economic stability played an equally crucial role in Rome's decline. By the 3rd century, rampant inflation and debased currency had eroded public trust. Caesar's gold standard, if maintained, could have prevented this downward spiral. His emphasis on infrastructure, roads, ports, and granaries would have created a resilient supply chain capable of weathering shortages. And let's not forget his land reforms. By giving veterans farms instead of lump sum payments, he ensured they became taxpayers rather than disgruntled drifters. Over generations, this could have built a sustainable middle class, the kind of social buffer that prevents revolutions and collapses. Then there's the question of governance. The empire's later centuries were plagued by short-lived emperors, assassinations, and civil wars, a stark contrast to Caesar's ability to centralize authority without fully alienating the Senate. His survival might have established a clearer succession mechanism, perhaps even a formalized adoption system like the one Augustus later used, but with fewer family dramas. No year of the 4 emperors, no crisis of the 3rd century, just a steady transfer of power that kept the machinery of state running smoothly. Cultural cohesion also mattered. The East-West divide between Greek and Latin spheres weakened the empire over time. Caesar's push for universal citizenship and his respect for local customs could have bridged this gap early, creating a shared identity strong enough to withstand external pressures. Imagine a world where the Byzantines didn't split away because the concept of a unified Roman identity was too deeply ingrained to fracture, but the greatest factor might have been momentum. Rome's decline wasn't inevitable. It was a series of missed opportunities and reactive fixes. Caesar operated on a different wavelength, anticipating problems, innovating solutions, and acting before crises erupted. His Rome wouldn't have just survived, it would have evolved, adapting to new threats with the same flexibility that once turned a small city-state into a Mediterranean superpower. The empire didn't fall because it was doomed. It fell because after Caesar, no one else could match his ability to see what Rome needed next. A more expansive Rome under Caesar wouldn't just have redrawn borders, it would have rewired the ancient world's cultural synapses. Picture the Forum not just as Rome's political heart, but as a bustling crossroads where Gaulish artisans bartered with Egyptian glassblowers and Indian mathematicians debated geometry with Greek philosophers. This level of exchange wasn't fantasy. Caesar's policies actively encouraged it. By granting citizenship across provinces, he erased the line between conqueror and conquered, turning subjects into stakeholders who brought their traditions with them. The result, a melting pot where Celtic metalwork might have fused with Persian motifs in everyday tableware, and African rhythms could have influenced Roman theatrical performances. Artistic innovation would have flourished under this cross-pollination. Greek sculptors, long dominant in Mediterranean aesthetics, might have found themselves competing with Parthian portraitists who prized realism over idealism. The frescoes in a wealthy merchant's home could have blended Etruscan storytelling with vivid Han Dynasty color palettes, creating a visual language entirely new. Even literature might have transformed. Imagine Virgil's epic poetry infused with the narrative structures of Sanskrit dramas, or Stoic philosophers incorporating Buddhist concepts of mindfulness into their teachings. The creative explosion wouldn't just mimic Hellenistic eclecticism, it would surpass it through sheer diversity of influences. Technology transfer could have been equally revolutionary. Rome's engineering prowess paired with Chinese papermaking might have given the empire a bureaucratic edge, with scrolls replaced by bound manuals for legionaries and tax collectors alike. Indian metallurgical techniques, superior for crafting flexible sword blades, could have upgraded military gear decades earlier. Even mundane advancements like stirrups, absent in Roman cavalry, might have arrived via Central Asian traders, revolutionizing mounted warfare before the Huns ever threatened the borders. The Library of Alexandria's archives, instead of burning in isolation, could have been duplicated across provincial capitals using these very innovations, preserving knowledge on an unprecedented scale. Religious practices would have reflected this blending too. Caesar's tolerance for local gods didn't mean passive coexistence, it was strategic integration. The pantheon might have absorbed deities like Mithras or Isis earlier and more thoroughly, their rituals standardized into state-sponsored ceremonies. In this alternate timeline, the cult of Sol Invictus could have merged with Zoroastrian sun worship, creating a unifying imperial religion that preempted Christianity's rise. Pilgrimage routes from Hispania to Mesopotamia might have buzzed with scholars comparing theological texts, their debates sponsored by a government that saw unified spirituality as a tool of stability. The most profound shifts, though, might have been linguistic. Latin's spread as a lingua franca wasn't inevitable, it was propelled by administration and trade. With Caesar's accelerated integration, Gaulish or Coptic could have contributed vocabulary and grammar structures, creating regional dialects as distinct as modern Romance languages. A merchant in Londinium might have spoken a Latin peppered with Celtic terms for local flora, while his counterpart in Alexandria used Greek loanwords for maritime navigation. This linguistic diversity, far from weakening Rome, could have made it more adaptable, just as English's global dominance today stems from its ability to absorb rather than purge outside influences. Yet globalization has its shadows. The same trade networks that spread art and ideas could also have accelerated disease transmission, with plagues jumping continents along silk routes. Indigenous cultures might have been steamrolled by Roman homogenization, their traditions preserved only as exotic curios in metropolitan museums. And let's not forget the darker exchanges military technologies like catapult designs or siege tactics spreading to rival powers, forcing Rome into an arms race with itself. What emerges is a world both familiar and alien, not the cloistered Mediterranean empire we know, but a truly globalized antiquity where a senator's villa might feature Indian ivory, Chinese lacquerware, and Germanic woodworking all in one room. The Renaissance's rediscovery of classical knowledge wouldn't have been necessary because the conversation between civilizations would never have been interrupted. History wouldn't just have moved faster, it would have taken turns we can barely envision from our fragmented past. Latin wasn't just the language of conquest, it was the glue that held Caesar's empire together. Under his prolonged rule, its spread wouldn't have been a gradual seepage but a deliberate tide, washing over regions from the Rhine to the Sahara, the key difference. Time in our timeline, Latin fractured into dialects as Rome's grip weakened, birthing French, Spanish, and Italian centuries later. But with Caesar's unbroken authority, those dialects might never have strayed far enough to become distinct languages at all. Picture a Europe where Latin evolved as a single, cohesive tongue, its regional variations no more divergent than American and British English today. The linguistic map would look utterly foreign, no Romance language family, just a monolithic Latin with local accents. The mechanics of this shift are fascinating. Caesar's policies accelerated Latin's adoption by tying it to opportunity. Citizenship required literacy in Latin, and provincial elites knew that speaking it fluently opened doors to power. Over decades, this top-down pressure would have trickled through society. Schools modeled after Rome's ludus system might have proliferated, teaching standardized Latin to children in Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa. Official documents, from tax records to legal decrees, would have been exclusively Latin, leaving little room for local scripts like Celtiberian or Punic to survive. Even marketplaces would have echoed with Latin's rhythms, as traders from different regions defaulted to the empire's lingua franca. The result, a linguistic homogenization so thorough that today's Parisian might speak a Latin as close to Cicero's as modern Italian is to Dante's Tuscan dialect. Yet languages never change in isolation. The Latin of Caesar's expanded empire would have absorbed loanwords at an astonishing rate. Celtic terms for woodland flora, Germanic words for winter gear, Egyptian names for desert landmarks, all would have seeped into daily speech, creating a vibrant hybrid vocabulary. Think of how English borrowed rendezvous from French or algebra from Arabic, but on an imperial scale. This wouldn't have been the sterile Latin of textbooks. It would have been a living, breathing tongue, as adaptable as the empire itself. Over time, regional slang might have emerged, but the core grammar and structure would have remained intact, enforced by Rome's centralized education and bureaucracy. The ripple effects on literature and thought are staggering. Without fragmented vernaculars, the medieval explosion of troubadour poetry in Occitan or Dante's decision to write the Divine Comedy in Florentine Italian might never have happened. Great works would have been composed in a unified Latin, accessible across continents without translation. The Bible's Vulgate, which standardized Christian Latin in our timeline, could have been unnecessary. Jerome might have worked with an already stable imperial language. Even the Renaissance's obsession with recovering pure classical Latin wouldn't have made sense, because the spoken and written forms would never have drifted apart. But the true loss would have been diversity. The fragmentation of Latin gave birth to a kaleidoscope of cultures, each with its own literary voice and identity. A Europe where Latin remained monolithic might have been more efficient but also less colorful. No Portuguese fado songs, no French existentialist wordplay, no Spanish magical realism, just variations on a single imperial theme. And let's not forget the marginalized tongues that Latin's dominance could have erased entirely. Breton, Basque, and Berber might have survived only in remote pockets, their speakers pressured to abandon ancestral languages for pragmatic reasons. Yet there's another possibility, a world where Latin's flexibility allowed it to coexist with local tongues, much as English does today in India or Nigeria. Caesar's pragmatism might have fostered bilingualism, with Latin as the language of power and local dialects preserved for poetry, folklore, and home. The empire's longevity could have depended on this balance, imposing unity without erasing identity. One thing's certain, the Tower of Babel wouldn't have symbolized chaos in this alternate timeline. It might have stood as a monument to Caesar's greatest achievement, a world where everyone understood each other. Caesar's approach to religion was less about conquest and more about absorption, a strategy that could have reshaped spiritual traditions across the Mediterranean. Unlike later emperors who viewed foreign gods as threats, he saw them as potential allies, weaving local deities into Rome's cosmic order with pragmatic flair. In Gaul, he identified Celtic Lugos with Mercury. In Egypt, he embraced Isis alongside Jupiter. Had this policy endured, the Roman pantheon might have evolved into something far more fluid, a divine mosaic where Mithras shared temples with Mars and Germanic Woden found his counterpart in Mercury. This wasn't mere tolerance, it was active synthesis, creating a spiritual ecosystem adaptable enough to absorb new influences without fracturing. Monotheism's rise could have faced steeper odds in such an environment. Christianity's appeal lay partly in its exclusivity, the promise of one truth in a fragmented spiritual marketplace. But a Rome where gods blended freely might have offered fewer cracks for that message to take root. Imagine missionaries like Paul arriving in cities where local deities already wore Roman names, their rituals sanctioned by the state. Conversion would mean rejecting not just idols, but a system that had made room for countless traditions. The persecutions that later galvanized Christian martyrdom might never have gained traction under Caesar's model. Why suppress a sect when you can co-opt its symbols? Early crosses could have been reinterpreted as solar symbols, their followers gently nudged toward imperial-approved cults. Judaism's fate might have been equally transformed. Caesar had granted Jews special exemptions, allowing them to avoid emperor worship, a privilege revoked under later rulers. His continued rule could have preserved this détente, preventing the tensions that sparked revolts in Judea. Without the destruction of the Second Temple, Rabbinic Judaism might have evolved along quieter lines, its diaspora less fractured. Meanwhile, Jewish merchants and scholars moving through Roman cities could have influenced this syncretic spirituality, perhaps introducing concepts like ethical monotheism into mainstream discourse centuries earlier. Yet the most profound shift might have been institutional. Caesar's Rome could have formalized religious blending into statecraft, creating a priesthood tasked with harmonizing rituals. Festivals like Saturnalia might have incorporated elements from Celtic solstice celebrations or Egyptian harvest rites, turning local traditions into empire-wide holidays. This wouldn't just ease cultural integration, it would make Roman identity irresistibly flexible, capable of absorbing devotees from Britannia to Babylon without demanding they abandon ancestral bonds. The ripple effects challenge our modern categories. Concepts like pagan and monotheist might never have hardened into oppositions. A Roman emperor could have been both Pontifex Maximus and initiate of Eleusinian mysteries, while a Gallic farmer might pray to a hybridized Ceres Demeter without contradiction. The Council of Nicaea's doctrinal battles, they might have seemed nonsensical in a world where theological diversity was the norm, but syncretism has its limits. Some faiths resist blending. Zoroastrianism's dualism or Judaism's covenantal exclusivity might have remained counter-currents, and without a unifying force like Christianity, Europe's post-Roman spiritual landscape could have fragmented into regional cults, lacking the coherence that later shaped medieval thought. What emerges isn't just an alternate religious history, it's a world where the divine mirrors humanity's complexity rather than simplifying it. The gods themselves would have worn many faces, and the paths to meaning as varied as the empire's endless roads. Caesar didn't just command legions, he redefined what legions could be. At the time of his death, Rome's military was already the envy of the ancient world, but his reforms were pushing it toward something unprecedented, a professional, mobile force capable of sustained campaigns across any terrain. His signature innovations, standardized training, modular unit structures, and integrated cavalry, were just the beginning. With decades of uninterrupted leadership, these changes might have crystallized into a military doctrine so advanced that later empires would spend centuries catching up. Take the legionaries' gear, for example. Caesar's troops carried pilums with iron shanks designed to bend on impact, disabling enemy shields. But this was merely one piece of a broader logistical revolution. His quartermasters streamlined supply chains, ensuring legions could operate year-round without relying on local plunder. Picture this system scaled empire-wide. State-run armories mass-producing identical weapons, siege engines pre-assembled for rapid deployment, even standardized medical kits for field surgeons. The result, a military machine where every soldier from Britannia to Syria fought with equipment as reliable as the training behind it. Tactics would have evolved just as radically. Caesar's adaptive battlefield strategies using earthworks as force multipliers, exploiting terrain with engineer precision, hinted at a future where Roman warfare blended brute strength with geometric calculation. Had he lived, we might have seen the first true military academies, where young officers studied not just combat drills but mathematics and cartography. The Marian reforms had already turned peasants into soldiers. Caesar's next step could have turned soldiers into scholars, their tactics codified in manuals that influenced generals from Napoleon to Patton. The real game changer, though, was personnel. Caesar's legions increasingly recruited from the provinces, offering citizenship as a reward for service. Over time, this policy could have transformed the army into a truly imperial institution, where a Gaulish cavalryman and an Egyptian archer fought side by side as Romans. The ethnic tensions that later weakened the empire, mitigated from the outset by shared discipline and shared purpose, and with veterans settled in frontier colonies, Rome's borders wouldn't just be defended, they'd be cultivated, with retired legionaries acting as cultural ambassadors who spread Latin, law, and loyalty. Yet the most tantalizing what-if lies in specialization. Caesar experimented with mixed unit tactics, combining heavy infantry with agile skirmishers and mounted archers. A prolonged reign might have birthed permanent specialized divisions, alpine troops trained for mountain warfare, desert cohorts adapted to scorched earth campaigns, even naval legions capable of amphibious assaults. The Roman military wouldn't have been a blunt instrument, it would have been a scalpel, its edge honed for every conceivable theater of war. Of course, no system is flawless. Over-reliance on centralized command could have made the legions vulnerable if leadership faltered, and the same reforms that boosted efficiency might have eroded the improvisational brilliance that saved Caesar at a leisure. But the trajectory is clear. His survival would have accelerated warfare's evolution, compressing centuries of medieval and early modern advancements into a single relentless century. The art of war might never have been the same, and neither would the world it shaped. Caesar's vision for colonization wasn't about planting flags, it was about reshaping humanity's map. His conquests already scattered veteran colonies across Gaul and Hispania, but with decades of unchallenged rule, those seeds could have sprouted into a vast network of Romanized settlements stretching far beyond historical borders. Picture Germania's dense forests dotted with planned towns laid out in perfect grid patterns, their forums bustling with traders speaking a hybrid Latin-Germanic dialect. Or the Danube's banks lined with thriving agricultural communities, their irrigation systems transforming the region into a breadbasket for the empire. This wasn't just territorial expansion, it was demographic engineering on a scale the ancient world had never seen. The key difference lay in incentives. Caesar didn't just send soldiers to occupy land, he gave them reasons to stay. Generous land grants turned battle-hardened legionaries into farmers, their plots strategically placed along roads and rivers to anchor new trade routes. Over time, these clusters would have attracted craftsmen, merchants, and families, evolving from military outposts into proper cities. Imagine Trier or Cologne rising a century earlier, not as frontier towns but as fully integrated hubs of Roman commerce. The ripple effects would have altered migration patterns dramatically. Landless plebeians from Italy might have flocked to these new opportunities, easing urban overcrowding while spreading Roman culture outward. Meanwhile, local tribes could have been gradually absorbed rather than displaced, their elites marrying into Roman families and their youth enlisting in auxiliary units, a gentler form of conquest through upward mobility. But the real transformation might have occurred beyond Europe's traditional boundaries. Caesar's planned Parthian campaign could have opened the floodgates to Eastern colonization. Picture Roman veterans farming the Fertile Crescent, their villages linked by Persian-style Qanat irrigation systems, or consider North Africa, where Caesar's agrarian reforms might have triggered a settlement boom in regions later lost to desertification. With enough political will, even Britain's rainy highlands could have been transformed into a productive province decades before Claudius's invasion, its mineral wealth fueling empire-wide growth. The demographic makeup of these regions would have shifted irreversibly: fewer isolated tribal enclaves, more multicultural nodes where Roman law and local traditions blended seamlessly. Language tells another story. In our timeline, Latin's foothold weakened at the empire's edges, giving way to Celtic, Germanic, and Berber tongues. But under Caesar's sustained colonization, linguistic assimilation could have run deeper. Military colonies doubled as language academies, their schools drilling Latin into children from Dacia to Numidia. Trade would have reinforced this. A merchant in Roman Gaul had no use for Gaulish when dealing with Syrian glass sellers or Egyptian grain brokers. Over generations, the linguistic fractures that later divided Europe might never have formed no Romance language family branching off, just a unified imperial tongue with regional accents as mild as those between modern American and British English. Yet colonization's darkest aspects can't be ignored. Indigenous cultures would have faced immense pressure to conform, their rituals sanitized into state-approved festivals, and their leaders co-opted as puppet administrators. The very roads that connected colonies also accelerated cultural homogenization, making it harder for unique traditions to survive. And let's not romanticize the veteran settlements. Many were essentially retirement plans for killers, their presence a constant reminder of conquest's brutal reality. The most profound legacy, though, might have been demographic stability. Rome's later struggles with barbarian migration stemmed partly from underpopulated border regions. Caesar's colonies could have created a human buffer, dense, loyal communities capable of resisting incursions without imperial troops. The Gothic migrations, the Vandal invasions, even Attila's rampages might have met stiffer resistance from a frontier that didn't just belong to Rome, but was Rome. What emerges isn't just an empire with wider borders, but one with deeper roots, a world where being Roman wasn't confined to the Mediterranean basin, but stretched from the Scottish moors to the Tigris Valley, not through temporary occupation, but through generations of farmers, artisans, and thinkers who knew no other home. The map wouldn't just look different, the people coloring it in would have been transformed beyond recognition. Caesar's approach to citizenship wasn't just policy, it was a revolution in identity. At the time of his assassination, he'd already extended Roman citizenship to entire cities in Gaul and Hispania, breaking centuries of tradition that reserved this privilege for Italians. Had he ruled another 2 decades, that trend wouldn't have just continued, it would have exploded. Picture a world where legionaries from Germania, scholars from Alexandria, and merchants from Carthage all carried the same legal status as those born on the Palatine Hill. The implications ripple far beyond paperwork. This was social engineering on an unprecedented scale, designed to turn conquered peoples into stakeholders of the empire they'd once resisted. Consider the economic ripple effects first. Citizenship meant access to Roman courts, contracts, and trade networks, tools that could lift provincial elites into genuine partnership with the imperial core. A Gallic chieftain's son granted citizenship might invest in olive groves in Baetica, while a Greek shipowner in Massilia could legally marry into a senatorial family. These aren't hypotheticals. Caesar's extant laws explicitly encouraged such mobility. Over time, this would have created a sprawling web of interregional commerce and kinship, binding the empire together with threads of mutual interest rather than sheer military force. The economic turbulence that followed his death, grain shortages, currency crises, might never have reached such extremes if provincial elites felt true ownership of Rome's stability. Then there's the military dimension. Auxiliary soldiers who earned citizenship through service became some of Rome's most fervent defenders, their loyalty cemented by upward mobility. Caesar's survival would have institutionalized this pipeline, potentially turning the legions into an even more diverse and meritocratic force. Imagine Parthian cavalry commanders rising to lead entire legions, or Berber tribesmen retiring as landowners along the Danube. The ethnic tensions that later plagued the empire, Goths in the ranks, separatist movements in Gaul, could have been mitigated by generations of shared service under the Eagle standard. The very concept of barbarian might have blurred into irrelevance. Cultural integration runs deeper still. Citizenship wasn't just legal, it was performative. New citizens adopted Roman dress, Latin names, and civic rituals, but they also brought their own traditions into the mix. A long-reigning Caesar might have overseen a Mediterranean culture where Celtic harvest festivals blended with Saturnalia, or Egyptian funerary customs influenced tomb designs in Pompeii. This wasn't assimilation as erasure, it was hybridization, creating a vibrant imperial identity flexible enough to embrace local flavors. The rigid Romanitas of Augustus's era, with its nostalgia for an imagined pastoral past, might never have crystallized. Instead, we could have gotten something far more dynamic, a world where Roman meant anything from a Druid-turned senator in Lugdunum to a Greek-speaking bureaucrat in Antioch. Yet the most radical shift would have been psychological. In our timeline, Rome's collapse was hastened by provincial apathy regions that felt little connection to a distant capital. But under Caesar's model, a Spaniard might genuinely believe the empire belonged to him as much as to an Italian aristocrat. Rebellions like Boudicca's or the Batavian Revolt often sprang from this disconnect. Here, they might never have sparked. Even the rise of Christianity could have played out differently without a clear other to rebel against. Its message might have resonated less as a counterculture and more as just another thread in Rome's spiritual tapestry. The risks, of course, were real. Rapid enfranchisement could have diluted the privileges of the old patrician class, sparking backlash. Traditionalists might have clung to outdated notions of purity, resisting the influx of foreign citizens. And let's not romanticize the process. Citizenship often came with strings attached, like heavier tax burdens or military conscription. But the alternative was the brittle, exclusionary model that ultimately failed, an empire too rigid to adapt until it shattered. What emerges is a Rome unrecognizable to later historians, not a conqueror squatting atop its provinces, but a true partnership where the boundaries between center and periphery dissolved. The echoes linger in modern nations built on immigration and civic nationalism. Caesar's genius wasn't just in expanding citizenship, but in recognizing that empires survive when people believe they have a stake in the system. The tragedy isn't that his vision died with him, it's that we never got to see how far it could have gone. Caesar's Rome wouldn't just have rewritten history, it might have redefined beauty itself. Unlike Augustus, who carefully curated art as propaganda for a restored republic, Caesar's patronage would have been bolder, more experimental. Picture Virgil's Aeneid not as a nostalgic ode to Rome's mythical roots, but as an epic celebrating the empire's kaleidoscopic present, where Aeneas' descendants included Gaulish warriors and Egyptian scholars. The poet's genius for weaving destiny into verse could have taken a different turn, blending Stoic philosophy with Eastern mysticism, or even casting Caesar himself as a new kind of hero, not just a founder, but a force of relentless transformation. Ovid's fate might have diverged even more dramatically. Exiled under Augustus for offending moral sensibilities, his playful, subversive wit could have thrived under Caesar's rule. Imagine metamorphoses infused with cheeky nods to Cleopatra's court, or love poems that spun tales of legionaries and Celtic priestesses. Caesar's own reputed affairs, from Servilia to Cleopatra, suggest a ruler less obsessed with policing morality than Augustus. The Ars Amatoria might never have been banned, leaving Ovid free to sharpen his pen on Rome's evolving social tapestry. Then there's the visual arts. Caesar's building projects favored scale and speed, but his personal tastes hinted at something more eclectic. Surviving busts show him embracing the Hellenistic realism of wrinkled brows and receding hairlines, a stark contrast to Augustus' eternally youthful propaganda portraits. Sculptors in this alternate timeline might have pioneered a hybrid style, Greek technical mastery fused with Gallic metalwork's intricate detail, or Persian motifs adorning public monuments. Even mosaics could have told different stories, not just triumphal battles, but scenes of multicultural trade along the Silk Road or scholars debating in Alexandria's shadow. Theatre, too, would have mirrored Rome's shifting identity. Plautus slapstick comedies might have given way to a new genre blending Etruscan farce with Egyptian ritual drama. Caesar's own fascination with spectacle, his mock naval battles and triumphal processions could have inspired playwrights to break the fourth wall, incorporating gladiators or fire dancers into performances. Imagine Seneca's tragedies staged not for stuffy aristocrats, but for crowds of veterans and merchants, their plots threaded with themes of empire and identity. Yet the most intriguing what-if lies in lost voices. With Caesar's push for provincial integration, literary greats might have emerged from beyond Italy's borders. A Gaulish Homer singing of Vercingetorix's defiance, or a Carthaginian playwright reimagining Dido's story from her own perspective, these could have entered the canon. Latin literature wouldn't just belong to Romans, it would be a collective project as diverse as the empire itself. The real tragedy isn't just the works we know that might have changed, it's the ones never written at all. Augustus' golden age came at a cost: conformity. Caesar's Rome would have traded polish for raw creativity, offering not a single vision of greatness but a chorus. And in that cacophony, we might have heard the ancient world's truest, strangest, most brilliant voices. Caesar's interactions with women reveal a pattern that defied Roman convention, not just in his legendary affair with Cleopatra, but in how he positioned female allies as political players rather than passive ornaments. Unlike Augustus, who later promoted an idealized image of silent, dutiful matrons, Caesar recognized the soft power women wielded in Rome's back corridors. His marriage to Calpurnia wasn't merely strategic. He valued her counsel, famously dismissing the soothsayer's warning on the Ides of March but heeding her nightmares. Had he lived, this pragmatic respect might have crystallized into tangible reforms, quietly expanding women's agency within the rigid patriarchy of Roman law. Consider the legal landscape first. Roman women couldn't vote, hold office, or control significant property without male guardianship, yet Caesar's circle included formidable exceptions. His daughter Julia wielded influence as Pompey's wife, and Cleopatra proved queens could rule as effectively as kings. With decades in power, Caesar might have incrementally eroded these barriers, perhaps granting wealthy widows like Servilia, his rumored lover and Brutus's mother, full control over their estates. Such changes wouldn't have been framed as radical equality. They'd have been practical moves to stabilize elite families by preventing fortunes from fracturing under incompetent male heirs. Over time, precedent could have trickled down, allowing merchant-class women to sign contracts or testify in courts without intermediaries. The religious sphere offered another avenue for empowerment. Rome's priestesses, like the Vestal Virgins, already held unique authority. Their sacred role let them own property and intervene in legal disputes. Caesar, as Pontifex Maximus, could have expanded these niches, creating new female priesthoods tied to imported cults like Isis or syncretic deities. Imagine a Romanized version of Delphi's oracle, where respected matrons interpreted omens for state decisions, or colleges of scholarly priestesses preserving medical knowledge akin to the Celtic druidesses Caesar encountered in Gaul. These roles would have given women public influence without directly challenging the Senate's male-dominated structure. Then there's the economic angle. Caesar's land redistribution plans favored veterans, but surviving letters hint he also considered subsidies for war widows to maintain their households. Extended over time, such policies might have spawned a class of independent businesswomen, landowners producing olive oil in Hispania or managing weaving workshops in Corinth. Cleopatra's Egypt offered a blueprint. Its women could divorce freely, negotiate loans, and even serve as tax collectors. Under Caesar's cross-cultural policies, Roman women in trading hubs might have gained similar rights, particularly in provinces where local customs already granted them more autonomy. The resulting economic clout could have shifted social norms far faster than any decree. Education would have been the silent revolution. Caesar admired learned women like Hortensia, whose rhetorical skills later shamed the Second Triumvirate into reducing taxes on wealthy matrons. His patronage might have established schools for elite girls alongside boys, teaching not just domestic arts but philosophy, medicine, and languages, skills useful for managing estates or advising politically connected husbands. Over generations, this could have produced a cohort of female intellectuals akin to Hypatia of Alexandria, whose Neoplatonist teachings flourished centuries later. The poet Sulpicia, whose bold love elegies survive today, might have been the norm rather than the exception in this alternate literary scene, yet the limits of Caesar's vision are worth noting. His advancements would likely have served class interests first, privileging patrician women, while leaving enslaved and plebeian women with scant improvements. And his personal life wasn't exactly progressive. He divorced Pompeia over rumors of infidelity, declaring his wife must be above suspicion. Real change would have required confronting Rome's deep-seated misogyny, something even Caesar might have avoided to maintain senatorial support. The greatest impact might have been indirect, by normalizing women as behind-the-scenes power brokers, whether through Cleopatra's diplomatic savvy or Servilia's bacchanal negotiations. Caesar could have reshaped cultural expectations. The domineering mothers and wives of later emperors like Agrippina the Younger were often vilified for overstepping. In Caesar's Rome, their influence might have been institutionalized, even respected. The path to gender equality would still have BEEN Chinese letter, but the starting line could have been centuries ahead of where history actually placed it. Caesar's dealings with the tribes beyond Rome's borders were never just about brute force. They were a calculated dance of sword and olive branch. Take the Germanic tribes, for instance. His famous crossing of the Rhine wasn't merely a show of strength. It was a psychological masterstroke, demonstrating Rome's ability to strike deep into enemy territory at will. But instead of pressing forward with permanent occupation, he withdrew, leaving the tribes unsettled and divided. Had he lived, this tactic might have evolved into something far more nuanced. Imagine a world where Caesar alternated between devastating punitive raids and generous alliances, offering select chieftains Roman support in exchange for loyalty. Over time, this could have created a buffer zone of client kingdoms, their leaders sending sons to be educated in Rome while their warriors served as auxiliary troops. The result, a gradual blending of cultures that might have prevented the catastrophic clashes with tribes like the Subai or Cherusci that came later. The Celtic tribes of Gaul tell a different story. Caesar's conquest there was swift, but his aftermath strategy was surprisingly inclusive. By granting citizenship to cooperative leaders and integrating Gallic nobles into the Roman system, he laid the groundwork for what could have been a seamless merger of cultures. With decades of consistent policy, this approach might have transformed Gaul into a heartland rather than a periphery. Latin could have replaced Celtic dialects entirely, not through suppression but through practical necessity, as Gallic merchants and landowners found Roman identity synonymous with opportunity. The Druids, once a threat to Roman authority, might have been co-opted as cultural ambassadors, their religious role preserved but stripped of political influence. Yet the greatest divergence might have been in Britain. Caesar's brief invasions were little more than reconnaissance in force, but his long-term survival could have accelerated Rome's foothold there by half a century. Picture legions establishing permanent forts along the Thames decades before Claudius's invasion, their presence fostering trade networks that linked British tin mines directly to Roman markets. Local tribes like the Catuvelloni might have embraced Roman patronage, their hill forts evolving into thriving towns with forums and bathhouses. The later rebellions of Boudica or Caratacus could have been avoided entirely, their peoples too enmeshed in Rome's economic web to risk upheaval. Conflict, of course, was never entirely off the table. Caesar understood that some tribes would resist assimilation at any cost. His solution: targeted annihilation. The fate of the Eburones, wiped out so thoroughly their name nearly vanished from history, showed his willingness to make examples of those who defied him. A prolonged reign might have seen this strategy refined, with rebel tribes systematically dismantled while their compliant neighbors prospered. The message would have been unmistakable. Resistance meant extinction, but cooperation brought wealth and security. Over generations, this could have reshaped the very concept of barbarian, turning it from an ethnic label into a political one, a term for those outside Rome's system, not those of a certain bloodline. The ripple effects challenge our modern assumptions about cultural survival. In our timeline, Germanic and Celtic identities endured in pockets, eventually reasserting themselves as Rome declined. But in Caesar's uninterrupted vision, these distinctions might have melted away entirely, leaving behind a homogenized frontier where a child on the banks of the Danube spoke Latin as fluently as one in Naples. The irony is profound. The man who crossed the Rubicon to defy tradition might have erased more ancient cultures than any barbarian horde ever could, not through destruction, but through the irresistible pull of belonging. Caesar's land reforms weren't just about politics, they were a blueprint for reshaping the Italian countryside itself. At the time of his death, vast estates called latifundia dominated agriculture, their absentee owners squeezing profits from slave labor while small farmers languished in debt. His solution: redistributing public land to veterans and the urban poor, creating a patchwork of small holdings that could have reversed Rome's ecological decline. Picture a Campania where diversified farms replaced monoculture olive groves, their crop rotations preventing soil exhaustion, vineyards interspersed with grain fields, orchards acting as windbreaks. This wasn't just social justice, it was an unintentional masterclass in sustainability. The environmental impact would have been profound. Large estates prioritized short-term gains, stripping nutrients from the soil with relentless cash crops. Small farmers, by contrast, tended to practice mixed agriculture, balancing cereals with legumes that naturally replenished nitrogen. Over decades, this shift could have prevented the desertification that later ravaged North Africa, where Roman overproduction of wheat turned fertile plains into dust. Even deforestation, A growing crisis as demand for timber and farmland soared might have slowed. Veteran settlers given wooded plots would have managed them carefully, their livelihoods tied to the land's long-term health rather than quick exploitation. Water management tells another story. Caesar's infrastructure projects included ambitious drainage schemes to reclaim marshy areas like the Pontine Fields. Had these efforts continued, they could have transformed disease-ridden swamps into fertile valleys while regulating water tables across central Italy. His engineers were already experimenting with terraced farming techniques borrowed from Hispania and North Africa, methods that reduced erosion on hillsides. Imagine these innovations scaled empire-wide. Check dams in Anatolia preventing silt buildup, stepped farms in Gaul maximizing arable land. The ripple effects would have stabilized food supplies for centuries, mitigating the famines that later weakened Rome's grip on its provinces. Then there's the unseen revolution beneath the soil. Roman agriculture relied heavily on slave labor, discouraging investment in labor-saving technology. But Caesar's land grants created a class of owner cultivators with incentive to innovate. The rotary mills and mechanical reapers described by Pliny might have appeared decades earlier, their adoption accelerated by farmers hungry for efficiency. Even crop choices could have shifted. Caesar's campaigns in Egypt introduced him to drought-resistant strains of wheat. His survival might have spurred state-sponsored seed exchanges, helping farmers adapt to changing climates. The true test of sustainability lies in cities, and here Caesar's vision was revolutionary. His planned rerouting of the Tiber included sewage systems to divert waste from drinking water, a lesson learned from Alexandria's advanced hydraulics. With uninterrupted funding, Rome might have avoided the cholera outbreaks that later plagued its cramped insulae. Green spaces weren't just aesthetic. His forum designs incorporated public gardens that could cool urban heat islands and provide fresh produce. This wasn't mere urban planning, it was proto-environmental engineering, recognizing that a healthy empire needed healthy ecosystems, yet the limits of ancient knowledge loom large. Without understanding crop science or groundwater dynamics, even well-intentioned reforms could backfire. Draining wetlands might have disrupted delicate ecosystems, and intensive farming still risked salinization in irrigated areas. The greatest irony, Caesar's military roads, while bolstering trade, also accelerated the spread of invasive species plant seeds clinging to wagon wheels, rats stowing away on grain ships. Progress always carries unintended consequences. What emerges is a tantalizing counterfactual, a Rome that didn't just exploit nature but learned to work with it. The environmental crises that contributed to the empire's decline, soil depletion, deforestation, water mismanagement, weren't inevitable. They were the result of short-term thinking that Caesar's long rule might have overcome. The lands he reshaped could have fed generations without exhaustion, their fertility preserved by farmers who saw themselves not as tenants but as stewards. That legacy might have outlasted even the marble monuments, a living testament to an empire that nurtured the earth as fiercely as it conquered it. Caesar's understanding of spectacle wasn't just about entertainment, it was a tool of statecraft. Unlike later emperors who built the Colosseum as a distraction for the masses, he recognized that grand public events could unify a fractured society under his vision. Imagine if his reign had stretched another 2 decades. Rome's iconic amphitheater might have risen not under the Flavian dynasty, but decades earlier, its sandstone arches casting shadows over a city still redefining itself. This wouldn't have been just a venue for blood sport. It would have been a stage for political theater, where Caesar's victories were reenacted with prisoners of war as actors and exotic beasts from his campaigns prowling the arena. The scale of these spectacles would have rewritten the economics of entertainment. Caesar's famed non-major mock naval battles staged in flooded basins hinted at his appetite for logistical marvels. With sustained imperial funding, these events could have evolved into permanent installations, complete with underground channels to flood and drain arenas at will. Picture a Colosseum-like structure engineered not just for gladiators, but for aquatic reenactments of Salamis or Actium, complete with scaled-down warships and pyrotechnics. The technology existed. Caesar's engineers had already built prefabricated bridges across the Rhine in days. Applied to entertainment, this ingenuity might have birthed a tradition of immersive historical pageants, blurring the line between education and spectacle. Gladiatorial combat itself could have taken a different trajectory. Under Caesar, these fights weren't yet the industrialized slaughter of the imperial era. His munera honored the dead. His daughter Julia's funeral games featured hundreds of gladiators, but also showcased martial skill over mindless violence. Had he lived, the games might have emphasized athleticism and discipline, evolving into something closer to Olympic contests with standardized rules and professional training schools. The Thracian-style fighters he favored, known for their technical prowess, could have become the template rather than the blood-soaked caricatures of later centuries. The social function of these spectacles would have been equally transformative. Caesar's populism leveraged free grain distributions and public feasts to secure loyalty. Sustained entertainment on this scale could have institutionalized leisure as a civic right. Tickets might have been distributed by tribe or neighborhood, ensuring even the poorest plebeians could attend. The Colosseum's tiered seating, which later reinforced class divisions, might instead have reflected his egalitarian impulses, perhaps with rotating sections so all social strata occasionally shared the best views. This wasn't just about fairness, it was social engineering, using shared experiences to dissolve old patrician-plebeian tensions. Yet the darkest twist lies in the arena's potential as a propaganda machine. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars were masterpieces of self-promotion. Imagine those narratives brought to life with captive Gauls reenacting their defeat before Roman crowds. Conquered kings paraded in chains could have been made to bow before statues of Caesar as living symbols of Rome's invincibility. The psychological impact would have been profound, not just intimidating foreign envoys, but conditioning citizens to see expansion as inevitable. Later emperors used the games to distract from misrule. Caesar would have weaponized them to glorify perpetual conquest. The financial implications can't be ignored. Building projects of this magnitude required vast resources, and Caesar's planned Parthian campaign could have supplied both wealth and performers. The treasure of Crassus's lost legions, if reclaimed, might have funded marble facades instead of war chests. Prisoners from Germania or Dacia could have been pressed into gladiatorial schools rather than sold as field slaves. Even the animal trade would have boomed earlier, with Carthaginian-style beast hunts showcasing giraffes from Africa or tigers from India decades before Augustus's reign. What emerges isn't just an alternate timeline for a building, but a reimagining of Roman leisure itself. The Colosseum we know became synonymous with decadence and decline. Under Caesar's direction, it might have embodied something far more complex, a crucible where violence, art, and politics fused into a spectacle that didn't just entertain the masses, but remade them. The assassination of Julius Caesar wasn't just the end of a man, it was the fork in a road that split history into two irreconcilable paths. One led to the Rome we know, shaped by Augustus's careful reconstruction and eventual decline. The other, a road untraveled, could have seen Caesar's unbroken will bending the ancient world to his vision for decades longer. The differences between these timelines aren't just academic, they're tectonic, reshaping everything from the borders of empires to the languages on our lips today. Think about the sheer scale of change. Military expansion alone would have rewritten the map, Roman legions pushing beyond the Rhine, securing Parthia's riches, perhaps even establishing footholds in lands history never connected to Rome. But conquest is only the surface. Deeper still, Caesar's reforms promised a social revolution. Citizenship stretched across provinces, turning subjects into stakeholders. Land redistributed to veterans, creating a loyal middle class, and a legal system streamlined to serve the many, not just the privileged few. These weren't just policies, they were the blueprints for an empire built to last, its foundations cemented in inclusion rather than extraction. Culture and identity would have been equally transformed. Picture a Mediterranean world where Latin, unfragmented by Rome's later fractures, became the universal tongue centuries earlier, a linguistic unity that might have survived the empire's eventual fall. Art and architecture, freed from the Senate's conservative grip, could have blended Egyptian grandeur with Greek elegance and Celtic boldness into something entirely new. Even spirituality might have taken a different turn, with Caesar's syncretic pantheon leaving no vacuum for Christianity to fill. The very soul of the West could have been pagan in a way we can barely imagine today. Yet for all these grand shifts, the most profound difference might have been one of momentum. Caesar's Rome wouldn't have been content with stability. It would have thrived on relentless forward motion. Scientific advancements, economic innovations, bureaucratic efficiencies, all accelerated by a leader who saw progress as non-negotiable, the stagnation that crept into the later empire. It might never have taken root under his watch. Of course, alternate history isn't about proving one timeline superior. Caesar's survival carried its own risks: overextension, autocratic excess, or even civil war if his reforms provoked backlash. But what's undeniable is the scale of the ripple effects. From the streets of Alexandria to the forests of Germania, from the halls of the Senate to the scripts of playwrights, Caesar's uninterrupted rule would have left nothing untouched. So what do you think? Would Rome have crumbled sooner under the weight of his ambition, or flourished into something even greater? Could the ancient world have globalized centuries ahead of schedule? The answers are as elusive as they are exhilarating, but that's the magic of what if. The past isn't just a fixed point, it's a constellation of possibilities, each one a doorway to a world that might have been. Now it's your turn to step through. Share your boldest visions of Caesar's uncharted future in the comments, and join us next time as we unravel another thread from history's rich tapestry. Don't forget to subscribe. The past has plenty more secrets to